Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another Climate Live K12 session for students, educators, and the public, a series brought to you by the Columbia Climate School. My name is Laurel Zaimashihi, and I'm the program manager of the K12 and continuing education programs at the Columbia Climate School, and I'll be facilitating the session today. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Climate School or are joining us for the first time, the Columbia Climate School is a newly established school at Columbia University for transdisciplinary climate research. This school marshals the university's strength in basic and applied disciplines, and it expands its resources to understand climate and its impacts on society, develop and inspire knowledge-based solutions, and educate future leaders for just and prosperous societies on a healthy planet. The Climate School is the first new school at Columbia in 25 years, so we are so excited, and it incorporates more than 20 different centers with over 700 different people who collaborate among different departments across the university, and this allows us to better connect, amplify, and advance new areas of climate inquiry, research, and impact across Columbia and beyond. So what we're hoping to do with these Climate Live K12 sessions is to introduce you all to the interdisciplinary work through our scientific experts. So these are monthly sessions that we run throughout the academic year. This is our second to last session. Our last session will be in June. We'll take a little hiatus throughout the summer, and then we'll rejoin again in the fall. So if you'd like any more information about the upcoming or past sessions, you can check out our website, and I'll put it in the chat in just a moment. We have all of these sessions recorded, linked on our website, as well as on our Climate School YouTube page. Each week we focus on a certain topic, and it will be directed toward a certain age range. So for today's session, it's titled Natural Ideas for Unnatural Problems, Ecosystem-Based Disaster Risk Reduction. And it's going to be led by Hannah Dancy, a program coordinator at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. This particular session really targets high school age students, undergraduates, educators, and the public. We welcome questions. So if you have any questions throughout the entire presentation, feel free to put them in the Q&A button. The chat for this session is disabled, but there is some interactive components of this session, so make sure you have your phones ready. And as I mentioned, this session is recorded, and so you will have access to it after we conclude today. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Hannah.
Hi, everyone. It's really lovely to meet you. This is Hannah Dancy with the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. Currently, I'm on the operations team there, where I coordinate trainings for emergency managers and other professionals in the natural disaster preparedness and recovery sections of disaster science. It's a very interesting subject. So just a little bit of context about me. I grew up in New York City, and I have a bachelor's in animal science and a master's in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology from Columbia University. With so many things happening to our climate and natural systems due to human activity, there is a really big focus in the ecology and conservation communities as to why people should care about ecosystems. Today, I'm going to explain why we need to care about the natural world and why it is so important to our communities and to ourselves. So welcome to Natural Solutions for Unnatural Problems, which will be focused on the topic of ecosystem-based disaster risk recovery, aka nature-based solutions. So the terms are fairly interchangeable. It's just a question of, are you in North America or are you in Europe? So in this talk, I'll be going into why natural solutions are necessary to protect our communities from natural disasters that are increasing in number and intensity thanks to climate change. All right, so let's just go over a quick agenda for today. So first, we have a summary of what disasters we're going to be discussing and why climate change has to do with them. Then we're going to go into hazard mitigation strategies to protect our communities from harm. Third, I'll introduce the concept of this talk, nature-based solutions. Then we'll put the talk into practice, what this will look like from a practical perspective. And finally, I'll open it up for questions. So like was mentioned earlier, there's going to be some interactive portions. So do have your phones ready. And it'll be just a couple of different ones. So you don't have to worry about your phone being on like 99% the entire time. So let's just dive right into it with the first section, disasters and climate change. So everyone in this room here has been affected at some point by a disaster, and this issue is only going to increase as time goes on. Some of us live on the coast, threatened by hurricanes. Some of us live on a fault line. Some of us live in dry areas that are prone to wildfires or tornadoes. But even past the big disasters, aka the ones that make the news, we've also got kind of smaller disasters too, so floods and landslides. But we also have long-term disasters, so like droughts, or like the disaster that's going to end tomorrow, technically, pandemics. So let's just meet a quick cast. In this talk, I'm going to be speaking about certain types of hazards that cause disasters, ones that we can reasonably say are exacerbated by human development and anthropogenic activity, aka people changing the land, the environment, that sort of thing. So that term encompasses a couple of different things. It encompasses climate change, where people's actions have altered environmental and weather patterns. And it also includes land use change, where that includes sort of people changing their environment to build cities, farms, and other sorts of human development. So here we have a few disasters that are more intense and more frequent due to human activity. Wildfires, where flooding, air pollution, and landslides are all hazards that can occur as a result. If you're wondering why floods and landslides are an issue for wildfires, just to let you know, so when severe wildfires destroy ecosystems and the soil kind of becomes unable to hold moisture, it becomes very dry. And so when the rains come, the water isn't fully absorbed and it causes flooding, flash flooding. And then in addition, along large hills, the trees and plant cover that's supposed to be there isn't there anymore to anchor the soil down. And so that leads to landslides as well. For hurricanes, hazards include flooding, storm surge, intense winds, and soil erosion, which we'll talk about later. And then drought, it can cause serious issues in farming, and that can also actually trigger disease outbreaks as well. Heat waves, big issue in urban areas, that can be considered a public health crisis, and that can also affect ecosystems as animals and plants are struggling to adapt to higher temperatures. So all of the disasters that I'm going to be talking about today and the ones that you see here are considered natural disasters. So we're not going to really talk about anything technological or human caused, so like war or nuclear meltdown, for example. We're just going to focus on the natural world. So let's go into an example. Hurricane Ida. Hurricane Ida struck Louisiana in September of 2021, and it basically expanded all the way up and eventually hit New England, and obviously New York City, as most of us, I believe, are based, before it dissipated over the Atlantic. Many states declared a state of emergency, which allows them to access emergency flooding. And vulnerable communities that live in flood zones were more likely to be affected by this, so that also includes disabled and elderly people as well. So these cascading events also caused various hazards across the country. Excuse me. For example, this event, the whole hurricane triggered a tornado outbreak that ranged from Mississippi all the way up to Massachusetts. And as many as 35 tornadoes were recorded, not observed, recorded. Furthermore, infrastructure was damaged. So for example, you see this flooded highway here in New York City. During a hurricane, water quality also drops in affected areas, and floods will pick up debris in soil, that kind of stuff, and that will leak into water systems. So that causes issues with the water quality. So we also have soil erosion along coastal, riverine, and riparian areas. Riparian meaning a transitory sort of biome or ecosystem that goes from a forested-esque area to a more river-focused area. So soil erosion is another factor. Again, I'm going to go into that at a later slide. But for right now, just know that soil erosion means a lot more flooding. So back to Hurricane Ida. Hurricane Ida is considered the 5th costliest hurricane in American history, and that's adjusted for inflation. I've seen a couple of different numbers, but I believe that the current number for the amount spent on recovery is about $75 billion. And I don't mean 75 with an M, I mean 75 with a B, $75 billion. And only one of the top 10 costliest hurricanes actually happened before 2000. The rest of them all happened afterwards. So we've recently seen an uptick in how much is being spent on disasters, and that begs the question, why are disasters more intense, and why are they so much more expensive? So let's address that. There are a couple different reasons. Due to an increase in population, we need more development and more infrastructure, so people-based things. So we're thinking like cities, farms, land. It's being converted into what ecologists tend to call human-dominated landscapes. Another term for this can also be the built environment. And these landscapes aren't really built to withstand excessive storms, and so they're more likely to get damaged. And then we also see climate change affecting weather patterns. This can cause anything from atypical weather patterns, decreased rainfall in some places, but increased rainfall in others. And then humidity and heat will hit certain regions and can cause ecological and biome shifts, which basically means the actual ecosystem itself will change as a result. Now let's look at some of the after effects. We see a lot of cascading events from disasters. So like I mentioned before, wildfires can trigger flash floods along with hurricanes as well. Subsidence, which is basically just land sinking into the ground, and landslides can be caused by both disasters and human modification of natural landscapes like mining, for example. We've also seen an uptick in climate refugees or climate migrants. And what that means is people fleeing from disasters. So I was in California last year. It was about a year after the Camp Fire, and that happened in 2021. This was a massive fire that spread across like 6 different counties in California. And I'm not talking like borough-sized counties. I'm talking massive, massive sized counties. They are huge. And I met some people in the community who were obviously affected by this fire. They had friends who lived in their community who, after the fire, they had fled to their family's house while it was happening and decided to stay there, which was far away. Their family was in like Idaho or something, and they decided never to come back. They just didn't really see a reason to stay. And that's a good example of climate refugees or climate migrants. So next, we have epidemics. Like I mentioned, they can be triggered by drought, or can be triggered by people modifying or overexploiting, aka overusing natural resources. And this can include hunting or poaching animals, which can expose us to diseases, or creating more breeding sites for mosquitoes and ticks, which includes more mosquito and tick-borne diseases. And also, because of past injustices, vulnerable communities are, for example, people of color in the US, disabled people, LGBTQ plus people are going to be affected by disasters more than their counterparts. So that basically increases social vulnerability in certain communities, and that's something to also be aware of. And then lastly, I didn't touch on it yet, so let's get into it. Soil erosion, like I mentioned earlier. I know this doesn't sound very interesting, very intriguing, but let me tell you, there's a lot going on. It's actually quite a big issue. So this is what soil erosion looks like. When you deforest an area for human purposes, like farming in this photo, or human development, like cities, it changes the soil. Soil itself interacts with the animals, plants, and fungi that live within it. And when it's deprived of nutrients by, for example, planting monocultures and farming, so like, for example, if you're driving and you just see like rows and rows and rows of corn or wheat or soy, that kind of thing, that is a monoculture. It's just one plant, one species, just forever and ever and ever. Monoculture. That causes a lot of issues with the soil because it just leaches those specific nutrients that it needs, and it is not very healthy for the soil. The soil kind of needs diversity, that kind of thing. Same thing with lawns too. Lawns are also a monoculture. And when you have monocultures, soil nutrients get leached away, and that topsoil then becomes poorer quality. So when rains erode that topsoil away, it goes down the river and it pollutes the river, and it means less topsoil. So that in turn, because there's now less ground, like literally less ground, that includes more flooding. So you're then going to have more flooding in an area, more water is going to cause more topsoil to be eroded. So you have this like vicious cycle. So you have soil erosion causing flooding, flooding causing soil erosion, so on and so forth. So you're just losing land, and the water is not healthy anymore. It's not really drinkable during disasters just because of that. It's a very simple description of what soil erosion is. So please do refer to this description, this diagram, just to kind of see a little bit more of the actual details. So this is a very specific problem that human-dominated landscapes are dealing with right now, and it's causing more and more like flash flooding disasters, that sort of thing. However, there is one important thing that we need to remember in this case, and that is we can't necessarily prevent disasters. The only thing that we can try to do is prepare. So we have this thing called hazard mitigation. What does that mean? Hazard mitigation are the actions we can take to prevent harm and loss from disasters. That description is pulled from the Federal Emergency Management Agency's website, or FEMA, and just kind of like a parsed down version of it. So feel free to check it out on their actual website. So hazard mitigation strategies are strategies that we can use to protect our lives and our livelihoods from disasters. So typically mitigation strategies are set up before a disaster occurs and can mitigate or lessen the impacts of a disaster before, during, and after the disaster occurs. So before, we have alarm systems, insurance programs, flood maps to predict what areas are more likely to flood. During, we have active mitigation infrastructure like levees that can protect communities from hazards. And then afterwards, we have assistance programs and shelter programs that can keep the community intact and get people back into their homes soon after a disaster happens. One example of hazard mitigation is gray infrastructure, or the built environment. These are things that we build to protect communities from disasters, and this includes piping and sewage systems, levees, embankments, seawalls, cooling centers against heat, vaccination programs, irrigation to prevent drought, and fire-resistant buildings against wildfires. However, there are a few pretty big worries regarding this gray infrastructure. For one, projects can be skewed and favor certain communities, or they may exclude specific communities entirely. So cooling centers or parks, aka green spaces, may not be accessible to impoverished or disabled communities, for example. And in general, more redline communities that were affected by redlining are less likely to have these sorts of green spaces available. Another thing that we've learned about these sorts of infrastructure is that this sort of infrastructure can fail, and it can fail pretty spectacularly. So with that being said, I'm going to show you two pictures. The first picture is a mosaic taken over a period of 18 months, and the second was taken 2 days after a disaster. My question will be, what happened here? So I'm going to pop over to Mentimeter and send you all the link. Please use the QR code when it's available, or visit the website to answer this question, which is, again, what happened here? So here are the pictures. So we have before a disaster, and then we have after a disaster. So this is what it looks like. So basically you can head over to menti.com. That's going to be MENTI. And this is going to be the code. It's going to be 9834 space 3141. And then I'm also going to just quickly pop over to Menti so you can see what it looks like. So take a good look at those pictures. And I'm going to hop over to Menti. You can also use the QR code here if you're struggling to hop on. All right. So what happened to this city? Why did this city get flooded? Okay, levee broke, question mark. Okay. Any other ideas? I'll show once again, just so you can see. So this is what it looks like. I see a question in the participants. If you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. But if you're having issues with the Mentimeter, I'm happy to pop back in. So I'll pop right back in. Any other ideas? All right, so you were right. The levees broke. So, like I said earlier, the first picture is a mosaic of images taken between February 2004 and August 2005. The second picture here was taken on August 31st, 2005. That was 2 days after Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans. Here, the levees built for a Category 3 storm failed against a barrage that the Category 5 Hurricane Katrina offered. And the storm breached the levees in about 53 different locations across the city. 53. New Orleans ended up spending $15 billion with a B dollars reconstructing their levees that finished in about 2019. But at that time, experts estimated that the levees might be inadequate in 4 years. 4 years from 2019, which is this year. That's now, this hurricane season. So what happens when another hurricane strikes? What do we do? And this may not be a full answer, but it does help a bit. Enter nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions, or ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, these sorts of ideas are extremely versatile. They have a couple of different things that they're required to be and do. They're supposed to be versatile and varied solutions or ideas or projects. They should have a really wide range of capabilities and designs, and we'll go over into some of the designs in a minute. But basically, nature-based solutions should be tailored towards each community specifically. In general, they should be considered varied, a set of practices that includes natural and ecosystem-based risk reduction. And they should incorporate and utilize natural processes into human-dominated landscapes to aid in disaster risk reduction. 3 is important, and I wanted to highlight it. They should be designed to work in tandem with gray infrastructure. Nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction is not an answer It's not oh, well, we'll throw a forest at it and hope that the trees will stand. That's not how it should work, right? It should be that there is thought, there is planning, and we incorporate it with our own built environment. They can't work on their own. And as we've already seen, gray infrastructure can't either. And finally, these solutions should always provide the community with more than just reducing risk from natural disasters. Should be more. So let's go into a couple of different types of nature-based solutions. The practice itself is fairly new, and so there isn't an exact science to it, but let's go over some of the currently established categories, thanks to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. And this is the type of categories that they have listed, so I threw this in here. So we have watershed or landscape, which is a large scale practice. We have neighborhood or site, which is a little bit smaller. And then we have coastal areas type, which obviously, I mean, as the name suggests, is a coastal area type nature-based solution. So watershed or landscape. So these practices are typically very large scale. So like I'm talking a forest, a wetland, a bog, that kind of thing. They are often very long-term planning oriented and coordination oriented because they are so big. So for example, we could have like a wide interconnected patchwork system. In ecology, we typically call like natural areas within more human areas a patch. And typically it's going to be kind of this web of restored ecosystems along human dominated landscapes, or it's going to be just a lot of like overall just one, I guess, massive thing. So one giant patch or a bunch of little patches all interdispersed but connected. So a good example of this is this, I guess, group of Japanese rice farmers who noticed that their wetland ecosystem was not functioning properly and was causing a lot of flooding in their rice paddies. And so this guy here on the page is not actually a Japanese rice farmer. I actually pulled this picture from the San Francisco Chronicle, but I feel like it still kind of hits home or whatever. So he is a farmer. Basically, so these Japanese rice farmers here, they decided to adopt sustainable farming techniques to manage the floods in their area and also the environmental degradation that happened because of the wetlands, because of their farming, and also because the smaller amount of wetland and an increased number of geese in the area meant that these geese were directly affecting their own profits. Which honestly, if you have met geese, I'm sure you would agree with that. Met many geese, and they're all very interesting characters. So what these Japanese rice farmers did was, instead of leaving their rice paddies dry during the winter, they flooded them, and they reduced pesticide and fertilizer use around the nearby wetlands, and then encouraged more wildlife to come back into those areas. So, you know, when you use pesticides, it's not just going to affect your farm, it's going to affect the nearby areas too. And so that was reducing the amount of insects in the area. And so when you have a more functioning ecosystem, that's going to encourage geese to prefer those areas. And then another thing that happened is that even though they made less rice, because the rice was now pesticide and fertilizer free, they could sell the rice for a higher price. And that also meant that they were still able to make a profit without increasing the amount of food that they needed to make. They were also actually able to profit off of birders who wanted to visit and view geese during the winter, which I thought was a really cool added benefit. So next up, we have a neighborhood or small site. So these are often really small scale practices in a neighborhood or in one location. And I want you to think of, like, if you're near a parking lot, it's going to be like the band of grass just alongside of the parking lot. Or like if you're walking down the street, it's going to be like the trees going down the street, that kind of thing. Very, very, very small. They're often built into the human dominated location as a site or as a corridor. And it can be in one patch or in a web. And oftentimes it can be used for stormwater or rainwater collection. So a good example of this, as you can see the picture here, is the Atlanta Beltline. It's an ecological patchwork of installations which kind of create a circle around the city center. And these patches are filled with native ecosystems and really nice art installations, which are good for recreation and also provide nice little ecological patches that can mitigate flooding and can collect stormwater or rainwater, like I discussed, like I guess highlighted previously. So lastly, we have coastal areas. These obviously focus a little bit more on shoreline stability. They can reduce erosion, and they can also protect coasts from storm impacts, so storm surge, like big waves, that kind of thing. It also is focused on coastal resilience, since they are kind of the first barrier to a storm. And they also can protect from flooding, they can absorb tidal impacts, and they can also filter water. I'll go into what that means in a second. So the example here is from Kenya. So the communities of Gazi Bay, Kenya, work to restore their mangrove forests in that area to reduce storm surge, store CO2, and prevent salinization of fresh water. Basically what that means is that mangroves are they serve this really cool function. Along with a couple of other types of ecosystems, mangroves, peat bogs, for example, moss. I read a really cool article today about moss and how much it absorbs CO2, but basically these sorts of ecosystems absorb CO2 and they just hold on to it. They keep it and it doesn't go into the atmosphere. But when you destroy these ecosystems, it releases all the CO2 into the atmosphere. Peat bogs is actually a really good example. I suggest you look it up. It's really fascinating. But this project specifically, it's been going on since 2004. And what it's shown to do is it reduces soil erosion in the area and it protects the area from flooding. Furthermore, like I mentioned earlier with salinization, what happens is that when you don't have healthy ecosystems, this salt water due to storms actually comes up rivers, and it means that these rivers are then not safe to drink. And when you rebuild these ecosystems, they serve as a barrier and allow the water to be fully potable or safe to drink. And then also, not just that, it also provides the local people and communities with good fishing opportunities and also provides them with fresh air. So I also just wanted to show this really cool video that I took. So I was in Japan about a month ago, and I thought it was I found this really cool small site nature-based solution. So I just wanted you to note the stormwater drains here. They go on for a few blocks, and then you see some planted flower beds for soil absorption. I'm just going to replay it just because it's so cool. There's also a gutter at the end of the walkway to incorporate with the gray infrastructure. And since this location specifically is near a river, it's really good for flood mitigation. So I thought this is a really cool thing to just find. I just stumbled across it. I was like, wow, this is awesome. This was a really fun time. Yeah, that's what I do on my vacation, is look for nature-based solutions. So switching gears, let's go into our fourth section, science, finance, practice. I tried to make those rhyme. They don't. So in this section, we're going to go over some of the more sorts of realistic parts of ecosystem-based disaster risk recovery, in our words, nature-based solutions. Let's just say that. We're going to do a quick look at the science behind it, how funding works, and what needs to be kept in mind when these projects are executed. So the reason why I have this section is because I want us to look at these like they aren't things that solve problems, right? These aren't strategies that solve an issue. These are strategies that help prevent an issue from becoming even bigger. And like any sort of nuanced thing in the real world, obviously there are going to be problems. These sorts of systems don't exist in a vacuum. And so I just want to take a quick realistic look at these, because even when we shine a spotlight on these examples, we still have to think about how long these examples took to plan, how long they took to execute, how we secured the funding, how long they're going to last, what problems are they going to encounter, right? And this is not to say, oh, well, this is not usable then if it's like not going to work full time. We always have to maintain it, but we always have to maintain everything anyway, right? The years are going to pass anyway. So we might as well try and incorporate these because they are helpful. And also, who knows, they could be cheaper than rebuilding $15 billion worth of levees. So how do they work, scientifically speaking? One of the major phrases that is seen in ecology and conservation is ecosystem services, or what ecosystems can do for people. Hazard mitigation is a major one, right? In areas that flood, coastal communities, so we're talking wetlands, seagrasses, dunes, oyster beds, they can manage flooding, storm surge, and keep undrinkable water from entering our systems. So farming, while promoting biodiversity, can protect fields against drought because, like I said earlier, your soil is healthier when you have a varied set of plants and animals living and interacting with it. When you have a soil that is biodiverse, has a lot of plants and fungi and moss, lots of moss, you have healthier fields that are a little bit more drought resistant. Urban tree cover manages urban pollution, so it provides people with fresh air, and it also provides people with shade during heat waves. That's pretty important, right? And then lastly, old growth forests with established tree cover and underbrush communities are more fire resistant than logged new growth forests. And they'll also anchor soil to prevent landslides, which I don't know if you remember, but we're talking about wildfires here, and wildfires can trigger landslides later on down the road. So there is a lot of discourse about logging and whether it's, good for the environment or if it's not good for the environment, because they plant trees and all that stuff, but there isn't really talk about quality of trees, right? There is a real dichotomy between the quality and quantity of a forest. And an old growth forest is it's just going to be more biodiverse. There are less trees in it, so there's less tree cover, so then you get more underbrush growing in it. So you're going to have healthier soil, you're going to have more diversity, and you're going to just overall have more fire resistant ecosystems. With new growth forests, often more logged, you're going to have too many trees for underbrush to grow super well, and the trees themselves are fairly young. And then also, just to mention, with healthier forests, they also will tend to have more biodiversity. And when you do that, you're going to have less disease spread. That's just kind of how it works. It's really interesting. I won't go into detail about it, but that's kind of a phenomenon that happens. So let's shift into something that none of us really like to talk about: money. What do the finances of these sorts of projects look like? Sometimes it can be difficult to find funding for these projects. Although, as the idea of nature-based solutions and of ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction gains more traction, more funding opportunities have become available in recent years. So some of the major costs include the planning phase, since you need to calculate what supplies are needed and make sure that the location is adequate from a community and from an environmental standpoint. You're not going to go in and kick a bunch of people off of their land, right? That turns out is going to cost you. So, and it's also just, it's wrong. It's just wrong. And then we also have the fact that a lot of people are going to be involved in this. So the community, obviously, you're going to have a lot of experts, and that's going to include a lot of money because you need to pay these people for their time. That's just how it goes. Then you also need to think about the long term. What's the upkeep going to look like? Newly restored ecosystems need a little bit of help to get jump started, and even then they might need continued maintenance. And who's going to do that maintenance? On the benefit side, sometimes these benefits can be difficult to measure. For example, you can find a discrepancy in asthma rates between neighborhoods, but how are you going to prove that that's due to increased green space, right? And, how can you show that more green space is going to help reduce asthma rates? So public health benefits of natural ecosystems are known in a lot of ways, but it's difficult to quote unquote prove or show. If a flood happens, for example, and a wetland prevents a neighborhood from flooding, we've got to show how much money is saved on flood damages, but how do you quantify that? We know that it happens, but what's the extent? How do we predict that sort of thing? However, we do know that there are a lot of public health benefits that aren't just recreation, right? Nature-based solutions can provide us with fresh water and air and healthier food. So let's put it into practice. First and foremost, a general idea needs to be in place and funding is secured. Obviously, the goal is to maximize benefits. How can we best approach a solution so that it provides as many services as possible for a long time and maintain itself? So when a project is developed, the approach should be multidisciplinary, meaning that all sorts of experts need to be involved to anticipate all sorts of challenges and address how long this project can last. So examples of experts include environmental biologists, environmental and civil engineers, architects, urban planners, emergency managers, public health professionals, nonprofits, and the list goes on. So this project should also be adaptable. The climate is changing, so is the environment. The plan itself should also be able to change within the changing world, and it should still be able to maintain its goal. And then lastly, most importantly, it should be community-led. The community is going to live with this project, so they really should get the first and final say, since they will be stewards of the project, right? And this should also be true for vulnerable communities or underserved communities, and especially true for underserved communities. These people need to have input early on in the process because this process is for them. They should get to approve the project. If a community comes to you, for example, let's say you're planning a nature-based solution, and the community comes to you and says, hey, we need oyster beds in this area. We used to have a ton, now they're all gone, and now our floods are worse. We need seagrass ecosystems to come back so that the waves aren't as intense. So they want to restore oyster beds and seagrass ecosystems to protect against the storm surge, protect against the flooding. And what if you just say like, nah, and you just build a park instead? What's going to happen? The park is not going to serve a purpose. It's just going to go to waste. And then it floods with the rest of the community. That is considered a lesson learned. So let's think of some other lessons learned so far. Let's use a big example of this. And not only am I going to use one big example, I'm going to use two. So the Great Green Walls are present in both the Gobi Desert in China and the Sahara Desert, which extends across Africa. So both deserts are increasing due to climate change and human land use change. When dry lands are overexploited without enough planning or sustainability, desertification occurs. It's a really slow growing disaster, and it's been gaining recognition with increasing agricultural needs, but not enough sustainable agricultural practices. So in 1978, China implemented the Great Green Wall, rapidly planting trees to stop the spread of the Gobi, which is a great idea, right? That's awesome. Anchor the soil in with trees, with forested areas, restore these ecological communities. people began to plant trees in this very beautiful ceremonial sense. However, they don't exactly plant native trees or trees that are resistant to drought or desertification effects, or they just don't have enough access to resources. And so either you're spending a ton of resources to water these trees or they die. Africa's Great Green Wall is doing better in that respect. The planning for it includes a lot of discussion about how to plant native trees that are drought resistant, how to restore these forested areas, how to incorporate it with the local farmers and herders and the local communities. But the major factor now is climate change. With temperatures in the region changing, this could potentially threaten the African Great Green Wall. So what do we learn from these situations? We need to involve environmental scientists on the project who are tuned into how climate change will affect ecosystem shifts due to weather pattern changes, and to always realize that we have to be adaptable. We always have to shift just a little bit, change our plan just a little bit so that it works. I want to shift gears a little bit because I just want to highlight something really important. Not everyone is affected by disasters equally. Underserved communities, like those that share a certain characteristic or a geographic location that means they are prevented from full economic, social, and civic privileges, those communities are more often affected. I roughly translated that phrase from FEMA's language, so it encompasses a lot of different types of underserved or more vulnerable communities. So during disasters, these communities are unable to access certain lifelines and resources that can help them recover, and in turn that can actually increase inequality. So look at what we saw during the pandemic, right? Certain communities were able to recover faster than others. In this respect, underserved communities are going to include Black people, Indigenous people, and Native Americans, Latino people, Asian American people, Pacific Islanders, and other communities of color within the United States. This also includes religious minorities, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ+ community, rural communities, and people living in poverty. Oftentimes these communities overlap. And you also can kind of sort of interchange the term vulnerable populations with underserved communities in some respects. Basically, the term that I've been using obviously has been more vulnerable communities or vulnerable populations. So for the purposes of this, they are the same. So let's just go over a quick example. Formerly redlined communities in cities comprising of more likely people of color and low-income communities are typically redlined and located in low-lying former wetlands. And that means that they're more likely to flood. And then not only that, but they're more likely to lose that land when the city decides that, oh, we need to build a nature-based solution. Furthermore, historically, redlined communities are found to have less green space, which exposes them to more air pollution and potentially higher asthma rates. In these redlined communities, we see, like I said, higher instances of chronic conditions. And then also we have communities that face discrimination. They usually get less resources and capacity to recover from disasters. So I was speaking, for example, with a volcanologist who studies La Soufrière, which is a volcano on the Caribbean island of St. Vincent. And what she mentioned was that the LGBTQ+ community in this area may be less likely to escape from a volcano eruption due to stigma, just because people don't want to let them on the boat. So communities are the most important part of nature-based solutions. When you include communities, then you can improve project design and target community needs. And this gets the community involved in these projects and means that the projects themselves will be more sustainable and long-term. And you can provide the community with more needed benefits. So let's go over an example. I realize we're running low on time, and so I hope you're okay with this. I'm just going to skip the Mentimeter question, and instead I'm just going to ask you to think about this in general. So I'm going to read an example of a nature-based solution. This is from FEMA's handbook, super cool, on nature-based solutions. And this is about Hunters Point South Park in Queens, New York City. This park gives residents a new space to play and relax outdoors, while also mitigating flood risk along the East River. Nature-based features include bioswales and street-side stormwater planters to slowly absorb and release stormwater, and 1.5 acres of new wetlands to shield upland areas from storm surge. So just for quick reference, bioswales, like vegetated low-lying depressions in the ground that are used to capture stormwater runoff. And then street-side stormwater planters, very hard to say, very fast, are similar, but are built into concrete instead of into the ground. So for reference, this land itself was previously an old industrial park, and this was converted into an actual park. So there weren't any people who lost land. So I want you to think about this. Regarding my example from earlier, Hurricane Ida, what services would this park have offered during Ida? How would this park fare during a Category 4 storm? So just think on that for a second. I'm curious to see what you think. So what services, AKA ecological services, so what sort of things would have happened to this park during a hurricane? So this park is considered a pretty successful project. It provides a lot of green space for locals. It's situated along a good location, and it provides a lot of protection against storms, but this is real life, right? Let's look over the pros and cons. So some of the pros, right? We have a lot of recreation, people can go and just play at this park. We have this natural infrastructure incorporated with gray infrastructure. We have this great location. It's along a river. It protects people from storm surge. These new wetlands will absorb that storm surge. They'll also absorb flooding. That's great. And then also it prevents soil erosion of that area. There are some cons though. It makes the neighborhood more expensive to live in. It drives up property values. We saw earlier some monoculture grass, and that's going to be expensive to maintain. It needs to be replanted and mowed and all that every year. And then also, honestly, wetlands, when they're first being established, they need a lot of help. The soil is a little bit poorer quality, and so they need a few years to kind of get going fully. And even then, they might need constant maintenance. This is New York City we're talking about. Needs constant maintenance. So, and then also, I should also mention, I said also not a lot of tree cover. I didn't see a lot of pictures of tree cover, so I'm thinking oh, it's probably kind of hot, on those just plains of grass. I would not want to play soccer on that in July. That just doesn't sound fun to me. So we're reaching the end. I just want to go over one final thing. And one of the main issues that I felt that I had with conservation and that sort of thing was I felt like when I was growing up I felt like there wasn't anything for me to do. And so for the high school students and for the undergrad students tuning in, I just wanted to include this for you. How can I help? So I just wanted to share some opportunities around New York City, and I'm sure if you're not New York City based, you can find these in other areas. So New York City Parks, for example, has a lot of volunteer opportunities like beach cleanups, forest restoration, horseshoe crab monitoring, and stuff like that. You don't have to be 18 to do those. If you do horseshoe crab monitoring, please send me a picture because I've never seen horseshoe crabs in real life, and I would really like to because they seem really cool. You can go by yourself or go with a group. If you are over 18, you can even become a super steward of a park, which I think is a pretty cool program. And then also the WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, which is I actually used to work there, offers the Discovery Guide and Project True volunteer programs. And those are ways that teenagers and college students can get involved in conservation education and urban ecology, respectively. So we're at the conclusion. I'm sorry, I won't take up more of your time. So in conclusion, Nature-based solutions are these really powerful tools that can help communities navigate the disastrous effects of climate change. I want to finish my talk with leaving you this. Nature is important to our communities. It is where we live, right? It is important to our people, and it is important to our bodies. Without our environment, we are nothing. Thank you so much for attending this talk. I will open it up for questions. If you would like my list of references or any resources from this talk, please do drop me a line. This is my work email. I check it every day except for Saturday and Sunday. And so I'd be happy to answer any questions you have afterwards or send you along some things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was incredible. Like, truly, I learned so much. I think everyone did. I wanted to open it up to questions in the last 5 minutes. So if you have any questions for Hannah, feel free to put them in the Q&A. And as we wait for those questions to populate, I also had a few questions that I was hoping just to get your thoughts on. So I love that you spoke about how critical it is for these nature-based solutions to be community-led. Couldn't agree more. I think it's like so critical to have that, community stakeholder buy-in, and this is their home. They are the ones that are going to be benefiting from it. So I think that is so, so true. And I was wondering if you had any strategies of positive ways to get community members involved, engaged in some of these projects. I know it's time consuming, like going to some of these meetings. And so I was just curious, like, what has worked in the past?
So that is a really good question. I unfortunately don't have like the best answers, so I won't be able to say all of it, but I think one of the most important parts is just natural education. So if you love a place, you want to protect it, right? And so if you not just love a place, but you know about a place, you want to protect it more. And so one of kind of my core memory, I was in the New York City public school system when I was a kid. And so like one of the major things was going outside in, the warmer months and just walking along the parks and learning about them. I remember one of my teachers like dropping some acid on limestone and just showing us like how it dissolved, and just all these like little things that just stay in your memory. And so the most important part is just getting people to not only like, they should have an intellectual connection to something, but also an emotional connection. And so that's really important. And also, I just wanted to quickly highlight that actually this picture is of my own home park, as well as my background. It's Riverside Park. And I spent many days just biking there. So that's kind of like, that's important, is get people outside. And when people are outside, that's what they want to keep it. Do you mind if I answer Dennis's question here?
Oh, yes, I was gonna bring that up next.
Awesome. So Dennis asked, you showed a green ring in Atlanta. Could that also include a walking or biking trail? And Dennis, the answer is yes, it includes both. And I walked it and it was super cool. And it was like I had this app that tells you kind of like what each plant is. So you can like put the flower up and hold the phone up. It's really cool. It's called Seek. And SEEK, like seek, like look for something. And it just tells you what the plant is, and it tells you about the plant. And it was super cool to just like walk along the belt line and just look at all of these amazing, just beautiful displays of nature. So yes.
I use Seek all the time. I highly encourage anyone who is just curious about the natural world, download it on your phone, and it's so easy to use. I use it all around my neighborhood at any time I'm on vacation. So Hannah, you look for nature-based solutions on vacay, and I am scanning all these different plants and animals. All right, I don't see any other questions. So maybe we'll conclude here. Thank you again so much. This has been such an incredible session. Again, everyone, we have one more session in June. We'll be joined by Paul Galley. And so I hope to see you then. Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.